April 1945. Germany is collapsing, but the war's final truth has not yet been spoken. As Patton's Third Army storms through southern Germany, it doesn't meet desperate resistance. It meets white flags hanging from windows, civilians crawling out of basements, and trembling voices begging for mercy. "We never supported Hitler," they say. "We knew nothing." But Patton refuses to accept words without proof. What happens next forces ordinary Germans to confront evidence they can no longer deny, evidence so horrifying that some collapse in silence, others break down, and a few choose death over living with the truth. These are the words history tried to forget. April 1945. Southern Germany. The war that had consumed Europe for nearly 6 years was ending, not with a final stand, but with silence. General George S. Patton's Third Army was moving faster than any force in the European theater. Armored columns thundered down roads that German maps said should have been defended. Towns fell in hours, sometimes in minutes. Entire villages were taken without a single shot fired. The enemy that had once fought from Normandy to the Russian steppes was no longer forming coherent lines. It was dissolving. As American tanks rolled into one town after another, soldiers noticed the same strange sight repeated endlessly: white cloth hanging from windows. Bed sheets, pillowcases, table linens. Anything white enough to signal surrender. Streets were empty. Shutters closed. Church bells silent. Then the doors began to open. German civilians emerged slowly from basements and cellars, women first, clutching children, followed by elderly men and teenagers too young to shave. Hands were raised. Faces were pale. Many were crying before a single word was spoken. American after-action reports noted a pattern almost immediately. The first words spoken by civilians were not political. They were not ideological. They were personal. Bitter: "Don't hurt the children. We surrender. We are civilians." Years of Nazi propaganda had taught Germans to fear the Allies, especially American troops portrayed as brutal and lawless. Some civilians fully expected to be executed in the streets. Mothers pressed children behind their legs, bracing for violence that never came. Instead, American soldiers searched houses for weapons, posted guards, and moved on. Relief spread quickly, but it was mixed with something else. Denial. The second thing German civilians said, often within minutes of contact, became so common that American soldiers began repeating it sarcastically among themselves. "We never supported Hitler." It was said by mayors who had flown Nazi flags weeks earlier, by shopkeepers who had donated to party drives, by men who had worn uniforms at rallies. One U.S. sergeant wrote bitterly in his diary that if every German claiming innocence were telling the truth, then Hitler must have conquered Europe alone. Some claims were genuine. There had been Germans who opposed the regime quietly, carefully, and at great personal risk. But many statements rang hollow, especially when spoken by people whose homes displayed party insignia or whose sons wore Wehrmacht uniforms. Civilians asked practical questions next. Would they be allowed to keep their homes? Would food be distributed? Would the Americans stay, or would the Soviets arrive next? That last question carried terror. By March 1945, stories from the Eastern Front had spread westward. Refugees whispered about Red Army advances, about violence and revenge. For many Germans, surrendering to Americans was not just preferable, it was a calculated decision for survival. In town after town, German officials surrendered without resistance. Mayors handed over keys. Police disbanded themselves. In some cases, civilians pointed out where German soldiers were hiding, desperate to end the war before their homes became battlefields. American officers noted the contradiction. These same towns had raised no white flags when Jews were deported. Now, faced with defeat, morality arrived suddenly, wrapped in white cloth. The age of civilians shaped their reactions. Elderly Germans who remembered the First World War sometimes muttered that this occupation felt less terrifying than expected. Children raised entirely under Nazi rule stared at American soldiers with confusion, unable to reconcile propaganda with reality. Teenagers from the Hitler Youth ranged from defiant silence to visible relief that the war had ended before they were sent to die. Patton observed all of this with growing anger. To him, surrender alone was not enough. Silence was not enough. Claims of ignorance were not enough. On April 4, 1945, everything changed. Near the town of Ohrdruf, elements of the 4th Armored Division and the 89th Infantry Division made a discovery that shattered any remaining illusions. Hidden behind barbed wire and watchtowers lay Ohrdruf concentration camp, a sub-camp of Buchenwald. What American soldiers found there defied comprehension. Starved bodies stacked like cordwood. Men beaten to death. Evidence of systematic murder. Even veterans hardened by years of combat were shaken. The smell alone was overwhelming. Soldiers vomited. Others stood in stunned silence. When Patton arrived days later, the sight broke him. On April 12, Patton toured the camp alongside Generals Dwight Eisenhower and Omar Bradley. At one shed containing dozens of naked corpses sprinkled with lime, Patton refused to enter. He turned away, retching against a building. "This is beyond belief," he said. Eisenhower immediately understood the historical stakes. He ordered everything documented: photographs, film, testimony. Not just for the present, but for the future. And then he gave an order that would transform the occupation. German civilians would be brought to the camps. They would see what had been done. No more denials. No more claims of ignorance. No more white flags hiding darker truths. As American trucks rolled into nearby towns, civilians who had hours earlier begged for mercy were now ordered to walk past the gates of hell itself. What they said next, what they did next, would be recorded forever. And it would reveal far more than surrender ever could. The trucks arrived without warning. In towns near Ohrdruf, Buchenwald, and other liberated camps, American military police went door to door. Orders were short and non-negotiable. "You will come with us. Bring no bags. You will see something." Men, women, teenagers, local officials, shopkeepers, teachers, pastors, anyone living within reach of the camps, were assembled and marched under armed guard. Some protested. Some cried. Some claimed sickness. The response was always the same: "You must see." As the columns approached the camp gates, the smell reached them first. A thick, sickly stench hung in the air, impossible to ignore. Civilians slowed. Some covered their mouths. Others whispered prayers. A few already knew what waited inside, but most did not want to believe it. The gates opened. Inside lay a world that words failed to describe. Emaciated survivors stared silently, their eyes too large for their skulls. Piles of bodies lay where they had fallen, unburied and half decomposed. Barracks were dark, overcrowded, and reeking of disease. Crematoria stood nearby, industrial machines of death, still warm in some places. American soldiers lined the paths, rifles slung, faces grim. This was not punishment. It was confrontation. Civilians were forced to walk slowly through every section. No rushing. No turning away. No covering eyes. At Ohrdruf, Patton personally ordered local Germans to bury the dead. Men who hours earlier claimed neutrality now used their hands to lift skeletal corpses into graves. Some wept openly. Others gagged and collapsed. A few stared blankly, as if their minds had shut down to survive the moment. Patton watched closely. He believed guilt was not limited to those who pulled triggers. It extended to those who looked away. To those who accepted comfort built on cruelty. To those who claimed ignorance while smoke rose from nearby forests. Many civilians insisted they had never known. "No one told us. We heard rumors, but not this. We were afraid to ask." Some claims were partially true. The Nazi regime was ruthless toward dissent. But the camps were not hidden on distant continents. They existed beside towns, rail lines, factories, and farms. Trains arrived. Smoke rose. Prisoners marched under guard. Silence had been a choice. Eisenhower later wrote that he feared one day people would claim the atrocities were exaggerated or fabricated. That fear shaped everything the Allies did next. Camps were filmed in detail. Survivors gave testimony. German civilians were photographed standing beside the dead. This was evidence, not revenge. The psychological impact was immediate. Local Nazi officials who had once spoken proudly now stammered. Some collapsed under questioning. Others committed suicide within days. Party insignia disappeared overnight. Swastika flags were burned, buried, or torn down so hastily they left scars on buildings. Yet even in this moment of undeniable horror, something troubling emerged. Not remorse, fear. Many civilians were not horrified by what had happened to others. They were horrified by what might now happen to them. Would the Americans punish the towns? Would food be cut off? Would men be arrested? Would the Soviets take over? In private conversations, American soldiers noted the pattern. Sympathy flowed inward, not outward. The suffering of victims was acknowledged, but often as a danger to the present, not a crime of the past. Patton's patience wore thin. He despised what he saw as moral cowardice. To him, the German surrender felt incomplete, too clean, too convenient. The same population that had cheered victories now wrapped itself in victimhood. He wrote bitterly in his diary that Germans were the lowest form of life, capable of discipline and efficiency, but lacking moral responsibility. Yet even Patton was conflicted. He admired German military professionalism. He respected their tactical skill. And he knew history was rarely simple. Entire nations did not move with a single conscience. Still, the camps changed everything. The war was no longer just about territory, armies, or flags. It became a moral reckoning. American occupation policy shifted rapidly. Denazification began in earnest. Former party members were removed from positions of authority. Teachers were questioned. Police were screened. Military tribunals gathered evidence for what would become the Nuremberg trials. The message was clear: surrender did not erase accountability. For survivors of the camps, liberation was bittersweet. Freedom arrived alongside unbearable loss. Families were gone. Homes destroyed. Bodies too weak to recover. Some survivors died days after being freed, their bodies unable to accept food. Civilians who had claimed ignorance now lived next to living proof of the regime's crimes. There was no escaping it. In towns once proud of their order and obedience, shame settled like fog. Children asked questions their parents could not answer. Neighbors avoided each other's eyes. Churches filled, not with faith, but with fear. And above it all stood the American army, victors not just of a war, but witnesses to a crime so vast it reshaped the meaning of victory itself. But as Germany collapsed, another truth became impossible to ignore. While civilians were being forced to look backward, the world was already looking forward, to a future divided, tense, and dangerous. And somewhere beyond the ruins of Europe, new enemies were forming. The war was ending. But history was far from finished. By the summer of 1945, the war in Europe was over, but peace felt uneasy, unfinished. Across the shattered cities of Germany, American, British, French, and Soviet flags now flew where swastikas once hung. On paper, the Allies were united victors. On the ground, mistrust was already spreading like a second occupation. And no one sensed it more clearly, or more dangerously, than General George S. Patton. Patton had spent months watching Germany collapse from the inside. He had seen civilians forced to confront the camps. He had overseen the dismantling of Nazi authority. And yet, as weeks passed, something disturbed him deeply. The Germans, he believed, were being broken too completely. Factories were silent. Infrastructure lay in ruins. Administrators were removed en masse. Skilled officers, men Patton considered professionals, not ideologues, were dismissed, humiliated, sometimes imprisoned. Meanwhile, to the east, another army was not disarming. The Red Army stood massive and intact. Soviet troops controlled eastern Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and beyond. Their tanks were not withdrawing. Their political officers were not dissolving. Their ideology was not being dismantled. Patton noticed the imbalance immediately. In private conversations with his staff, he spoke openly and recklessly. "We're disarming the wrong people," he said more than once. "The real enemy is still armed." To Patton, Nazism had been defeated militarily and morally. But communism, he believed, was expanding under the cover of victory. Where Nazi banners had fallen, red flags were rising. He watched Soviet behavior with growing alarm. German civilians fleeing west told stories of forced labor, mass arrests, disappearances. Entire towns emptied overnight. Former prisoners were replaced by new ones. Patton began to say the unthinkable. That the war should not have ended when it did. That Allied forces should have continued east. That Germany, rearmed, supervised, and integrated, should be used as a buffer against Stalin. It was a shocking idea. Only weeks earlier, Germans had been the enemy responsible for genocide and devastation. Now Patton spoke of them as potential allies. His views were explosive and deeply unpopular. General Eisenhower, now Supreme Commander, understood the geopolitical shift but rejected Patton's tone and urgency. The American public was exhausted. Millions of soldiers wanted to go home. The idea of confronting the Soviet Union immediately, after defeating Hitler, was politically impossible. Patton didn't care. He believed history punished hesitation. In his diary, he wrote that the Allies had won the battle, but were losing the future. He described Soviet leadership as brutal, expansionist, and ideologically incompatible with freedom. Unlike Nazism, he feared communism could not be defeated with a single surrender. It required containment, or confrontation. These opinions did not stay private. Patton spoke freely to journalists, to junior officers, even to civilians. He criticized denazification policies openly, calling them unfair and counterproductive. He complained that former Nazi Party membership had become a blanket crime, ignoring context and coercion. In one interview, he compared Nazism to political parties in America, an analogy that detonated like a grenade. The backlash was immediate. Headlines exploded. Washington was furious. Allied command feared Patton was undermining occupation policy and diplomatic unity at the most delicate moment in modern history. For Eisenhower, the situation became untenable. Patton was a brilliant battlefield commander, but occupation required diplomacy, restraint, and silence. Qualities Patton neither valued nor possessed. In September 1945, he was relieved of command of the Third Army. Officially, it was a reassignment. In reality, it was a removal. Patton was sent to command the 15th Army, a paper unit tasked with writing histories of the war, far from power, far from troops, far from decisions that mattered. The message was clear. The war Patton understood was over. The war that was beginning would be fought differently. The general took the demotion hard. He felt betrayed. Sidelined. Ignored at the moment he believed clarity mattered most. He watched as Soviet influence hardened across Eastern Europe, exactly as he had predicted. Iron curtains did not fall overnight, but the shadows were already visible. Patton continued to speak bluntly in private. He warned that the Soviets would test the West. That appeasement would fail. That another conflict was inevitable. History would later prove many of his strategic fears accurate. But timing is everything. In 1945, Patton's voice was too sharp, too soon, too dangerous for a world desperate to believe the fighting was finally finished. And then, suddenly, the voice went silent. On December 9, 1945, George S. Patton was injured in a car accident near Mannheim, Germany. A low-speed collision. Minor injuries for everyone else. For Patton, it was catastrophic. Within days, the most aggressive general of the European war lay paralyzed, his career and life slipping away. The man who had raced across continents now stared at a ceiling. And the world he had warned about was already beginning to take shape. On December 21, 1945, in a quiet military hospital in Heidelberg, Germany, General George S. Patton Jr. died. He was 60 years old. There were no cannons fired. No parades. No victory speeches. The war's most aggressive battlefield commander passed not in combat, but in a hospital bed, paralyzed from the neck down after a car accident that seemed, on the surface, unremarkable. The irony was impossible to ignore. Patton had survived tank battles, artillery barrages, ambushes, and near misses across 2 continents. He had walked under fire with pistols at his hips and spoken calmly as shells fell nearby. Yet in peacetime Germany, weeks after victory, his body failed him. In the days leading to his death, Patton remained painfully aware of what was happening. He joked with nurses. He spoke with his wife, Beatrice. He asked about his men. He expressed frustration, not fear. "This is a hell of a way for a soldier to die," he reportedly said. Those words captured the essence of Patton, a man built for motion, conflict, and command, trapped in stillness. News of his death spread quickly through the American army. Among the soldiers who had served under him, the reaction was raw. Many credited Patton with saving their lives through speed, decisiveness, and relentless pressure on the enemy. To them, he was not reckless, he was decisive. Others remembered his flaws just as clearly. His temper, his ego, his refusal to soften his language, even when history demanded tact. But even critics acknowledged one truth: Patton was never unclear. He believed wars were won by momentum, not hesitation. He believed moral clarity mattered more than public comfort. And he believed the greatest mistake was assuming that victory automatically brought peace. At his request, Patton was buried in Luxembourg, among the men of the Third Army. Not in Arlington. Not beneath monuments. But among soldiers. His grave faces outward, toward Germany. In the months and years that followed, the world moved exactly as Patton had feared. By 1948, the Soviet Union had solidified control over Eastern Europe. Communist governments replaced democratic hopes in Poland, Hungary, Romania, and Czechoslovakia. Berlin became a divided city, then a blockaded one. NATO formed. The Warsaw Pact followed. The Cold War had begun. Germany, once the enemy Patton argued should not be crushed entirely, became the front line of a divided world. West Germany was rebuilt, rearmed, and integrated into the Western Alliance. East Germany became a Soviet satellite state. History, it seemed, had split the difference, too late for Patton to see. In hindsight, his warnings appear less radical than they once did. The fear of Soviet expansion was not paranoia. The importance of rebuilding Germany was not naivete. The danger of ideological warfare proved real and enduring. But history is not kind to men who speak truths before the world is ready to hear them. Patton's legacy remains complicated. He was not a saint. He was not always right. He said things that were careless, offensive, and politically disastrous. Yet he also understood something essential about power, that it does not pause simply because one enemy has fallen. The world after World War II was not a clean slate. It was a continuation, shaped by new lines, new fears, and new forms of conflict. Patton sensed that instinctively. Today, historians still debate him. Was he a visionary or a liability? A necessary brute or an uncontrollable force? A general ahead of his time, or trapped by it? Perhaps he was all of these at once. What is undeniable is this: George S. Patton did not fit neatly into the peace that followed the war he helped win. He was forged for storms. And when the storm passed, the silence that followed proved just as lethal. The world moved on. The warnings echoed. And history, as always, rendered its judgment slowly. History did not rush to judge George S. Patton. In the years immediately after his death, the world was too busy surviving what he had warned about. Europe rebuilt itself slowly, brick by brick, under the shadow of two superpowers staring each other down across borders drawn in haste. Former enemies became allies. Former allies became rivals. And Germany, the nation Patton believed should never be completely broken, stood at the center of it all, split in two like a scar that refused to heal. As the Cold War hardened, Patton's name began to resurface, not as a general of tanks and speed, but as a symbol of uncomfortable foresight. Documents were declassified. Diaries published. Private conversations revealed. And suddenly, statements once dismissed as reckless began to sound eerily accurate. Patton had not predicted every outcome. He underestimated the long-term stability of Western Europe. He overestimated how quickly military confrontation might erupt with the Soviets. And he failed to grasp how deeply exhausted the world truly was in 1945. But on one point, he had been unshakably right. Power never rests. While the West dismantled its armies and debated moral responsibility, the Soviet Union consolidated strength. Intelligence networks expanded. Nuclear weapons entered the equation. Ideology replaced territory as the new battlefield. The war had not ended. It had transformed. Ironically, many of the policies Patton argued against in 1945 were quietly revised within a few years. Denazification softened. Former German officers were consulted, then recruited. West Germany was rebuilt into a military and economic pillar of the Western Alliance. What Patton suggested bluntly and prematurely became policy, carefully, diplomatically, and without his name attached. That is often how history works. It absorbs the ideas of difficult men, while discarding the men themselves. In popular culture, Patton's image evolved unevenly. To some, he became a caricature, obsessed with glory, crude in speech, obsessed with battle. To others, especially veterans, he remained a commander who understood the brutal reality of war better than politicians ever could. The 1970 film Patton cemented this dual legacy. George C. Scott's portrayal captured the fire, the ego, the brilliance, but also the isolation. The man standing alone before history, certain of his convictions, unwilling to dilute them for approval. What the film could not fully show was Patton's deepest fear. Not defeat. Irrelevance. Patton believed that the worst fate for a soldier was not death, but silence. Being ignored when the future stood at a crossroads. Watching decisions be made by those who had never seen what he had seen. In that sense, his death came at the cruelest possible moment. He did not live to see the Berlin airlift. He did not witness NATO's formation. He did not hear Churchill's Iron Curtain speech. Each event echoed his concerns. Yet Patton remained absent from the table where history turned. Even today, his reputation resists simplicity. He is admired by military strategists for his operational genius, his understanding of tempo, pressure, and exploitation. His rapid advances across France remain textbook examples of maneuver warfare. But he is criticized, rightly, for his moral blind spots, for statements that trivialized suffering, for moments where discipline failed him as a leader. Both truths coexist. That tension is what makes Patton endure. He represents the danger and necessity of clarity in times of chaos. The risk of speaking too soon, and the cost of speaking too late. Most leaders are shaped by their moment. Patton was shaped for moments that did not yet exist. In the end, perhaps the most revealing judgment of Patton came not from historians or politicians, but from the soldiers who followed him. Many said the same thing in different words. He was hard. He was unfair. He was terrifying. But when things went bad, he was the man you wanted in front of you. That may be the closest thing to truth history ever offers. Not approval. Not condemnation. But understanding. George S. Patton did not fit the peace that followed World War II because peace required compromise, and Patton believed compromise was how wars were lost. The world chose a different path. And yet, step by step, it walked closer to the future he had described. Without applause. Without acknowledgement. Without him. The storm passed. The silence followed. And history kept moving, carrying fragments of Patton's warnings with it, whether it wished to or not.